Before we get started on John 19, I want to mention one thing. A lot of you, if you're on the DC Connect email list, you got a message from me this week, a little video link there, talking about water baptism. And if you didn't get the message, I'll just tell you what I'm thinking about. There are some of you, maybe quite a few of you, that have never gotten baptized. You're a follower of Jesus, but for whatever reason, you just never got around to doing that. And baptism is not what saves us, but it is one of those things that Jesus said he wanted his followers to do as a public statement of their faith in him. And some of you meant to do it like 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 5 years ago, or last year, and somehow it just kind of kept getting put off, and now it's almost embarrassing to go, I really never did that, but you'd like to take care of that bit of unfinished business. And so I would like to kind of open up, if you will, a baptism amnesty program. And what I'm thinking is we're going to do like a single class, and if you are interested, that doesn't mean you've committed to anything. It just means that you would like to sit down, think a bit more about what baptism is really all about, and if that is a step that you are ready to take, whether you should have done it 40 years ago or last week, doesn't matter. Would you just let me know? And the easiest way to do that today would be those communication cards, the welcome cards in your bulletin. If you just put your name on there, your phone number, and just put down baptism class or something like that and drop it off in one of the offering boxes or at the welcome desk. I'll be sure to keep you posted as plans develop. But some of you I know have that little bit of unfinished business, and I just would encourage you to take this opportunity. All right, I have talked several times about, and generally in a disrespectful manner, about the small dog that lives at my house, the Chihuahua, which has delusions of grandeur because she thinks that she's a real dog, and she actually thinks she's a big dog. And she will take on any dog that comes in the yard. Doesn't matter the size. Chica is convinced that she can take him in a fair fight. And that's the reason why when our oldest son, Michael, called one day and he said they were coming to visit, and he said, is it okay if we bring Summer along with us? Now, Summer is their mini Aussie. And Michael and I talked, and I said, well, I'm not sure how that's going to go with Chica if Summer shows up in the yard. There could be a lot of fur flying. So we talked about it, and we decided that we would see if we could, negotiate some kind of a truce between Summer and Chica. And so Michael came over, they brought the dog along, and Summer actually got loose from her leash just before they got in the house. So when I opened the door, Summer just walks right in. And I'm thinking, oh, this is not going to go well. Chica simply steps aside, doesn't utter a peep, and lets Summer walk on by her. These two dogs have never fought. They've never growled at each other. They've never barked at each other. It's just like Summer's always lived there, and Summer's in charge. Now, I don't know what it is, but there is something about just the way that this dog carries itself that my dog went, okay, fine, you're the boss. No problem. It just has bearing. I don't know how else to say it. It just has this bearing that my dog respects. I watched a movie a few years ago with Robert Redford. The movie was called The Last Castle. And in that movie, Redford plays the character of General Eugene Irwin, who is a much decorated, highly venerated military commander, but he's become court-martialed. And as the movie unfolds, you learn that he actually was trying to protect his troops, and that's the reason he took the actions that resulted in a court-martial. But all that story aside, he's now been brought to a military prison. And when he gets to this prison, he meets the commandant there, who you discover is a fairly insecure leader, who is trying to prove that he is a great man, whereas General Irwin really is a great man. And that becomes obvious as the two of them meet for the first time, that one of these men just carries himself with a bearing that indicates he is a man of real power and of real respect. And the other man becomes very obvious that he really is a coward. You ever met someone like that? You ever met someone that just their bearing, just the way they came into the room, just the way they engaged in conversation, you knew that this was a person with some gravitas. Not because they were trying to lord it over anyone, they weren't trying to impress. You just could tell that they had that bearing. I think Jesus was that kind of man. John has shown us throughout that in a whole variety of different situations, as people encountered Jesus, their response was, no one has ever taught the way this man teaches. No one has done what this man does. Just to be with him, I come away feeling that I am with someone of significance, someone who has bearing. And as you see Jesus come into the final hours before the cross, you see him as a man who is in command. Judas, who has betrayed him, thinks that he has been all sly and sneaky and he's going to sneak out of dinner and go sell Jesus out. And yet Jesus suddenly confronts Judas and he says, what you're going to do quickly. And Judas immediately went out and it was night. Jesus does not let Judas sneak away. He dismisses him as though he's sending him on an errand. Because the message is, Judas, I'm in control here. You may think you're selling me out, but I am still in control. When Judas brings the mob to arrest Jesus, we talked about this last week. There are probably hundreds of soldiers that show up, and the intent is shock and awe. They are going to catch Jesus by surprise at a moment of vulnerability where he's defenseless, and they're going to overwhelm him with the show of force. And instead, when they show up, it is Jesus who overwhelms them. John says that Jesus came forward and said to them, whom do you seek? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he. When Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. When Jesus meets with the high priest tries to interrogate him, and Jesus simply refuses to answer. And an officer strikes Jesus to rebuke him for not respecting the high priest. Jesus answered, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong, but if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Jesus doesn't show any fear at being confronted in this way, even before the high priest. And even when we get to the cross, John chapter 19 at the end, as Jesus is literally breathing his last breaths, he pauses to be sure that his mother Mary is being properly cared for. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. All throughout John's gospel, he wants to understand that Jesus was never a victim of history. I said this last week. He was not a good man who just got caught at the wrong time in the wrong place. Jesus was moving toward a goal, and he was in control of it all the way through because he intended to go to the cross. It was the plan. The interaction that I want us to focus on this morning is between Jesus and the Roman governor Pilate. It's interesting that John gives significant attention to this interchange. In John chapter 18, almost a third of the chapter is about the communication between Jesus and Pilate. And in John 19, just over half of the chapter has to do with Pilate's role in the trial of Jesus. It's the most interaction that we see Jesus have with the power structures of the Gentile world. Normally, it's been the leaders of the Jewish people that we've seen Jesus in conflict with. But now we see him before one of the leaders within the Roman world. I think that one of the things John wants us to understand is that the sin that lay at the root of Jesus' rejection was not just a Jewish problem. Jesus came as the Savior of the whole world. John has said that a couple times, Jew and Gentile, because both Jew and Gentile find themselves caught up in the same kind of vain pride and desire for personal power. So let's read the account of Jesus and Pilate. We're going to have to go back to John 18, verse 28, but I'd just like you to hear the full narrative of this interaction between Jesus and Pilate. They led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered him, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. The Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold, the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law. According to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Who was Pilate? Well, Pilate was originally a soldier. Specifically, he was a cavalry officer in the Roman army. He was also the friend of a man named Sejanus. Sejanus was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard under Emperor Tiberius. Sejanus was highly regarded by Tiberius, one of his most trusted advisors. Tacitus, the Roman historian, has said that the closer a man is with Sejanus, the stronger his claim to the emperor's friendship. And it appears that it was Sejanus who secured for Pilate his governorship in Judea. Pilate himself was described by Josephus as being a very headstrong and an authoritarian leader. And while he was over the province of the Jews and the Samaritans, he really had very little regard for them. In fact, he was responsible for provoking them to riot. He provoked the Jews by hanging images of Emperor Tiberius throughout Jerusalem. He then had coins minted that bore religious pagan symbols and had them used throughout Judea, further angering the Jews. he managed to anger the Samaritans and even attack the Samaritans as well. And the undoing for Pilate came when eventually the Samaritans lodged a complaint with Pilate's superior, a man named Vitellius, because Pilate had attacked them at Mount Gerizim about 36 AD. The result of those accusations were that Pilate was ordered back to Rome to stand trial. He was put on trial for cruelty, oppression, and for executing men without a proper trial. Eusebius of Caesarea records that ultimately Pilate killed himself on orders from the successor to Tiberius, the Emperor Caligula. So that is Pilate's history. A soldier elevated to governor because of his political connections, cruel, authoritarian, eventually reported to his superiors, and ultimately forced to take his own life by the emperor. Why did Pilate get involved with the trial of Jesus? Well, the Jewish leaders needed Rome. They needed Rome for a couple reasons. One was the authority to execute someone. The Jewish leaders did not have the authority to execute on their own, and so they needed Rome to carry out capital punishment. However, I don't think that was the primary reason that the Jews brought Jesus to Pilate. We know that they had already tried at least a couple times to stone Jesus, and they hadn't gone looking for approval from Pilate before they did that. We know that later on, the first martyr in the Christian church, a man named Stephen, was stoned to death by the Jews. And again, they didn't go to the Romans to get permission before they did that. The Apostle Paul himself was stoned by the Jews. They thought they had killed him. He was left for dead. God spared his life. But again, when it came to taking out their fury on someone and killing them, the Jews were perfectly capable and would find ways to do that on their own if that was the only reason. I think the bigger reason that they wanted to get Pilate involved was to provide cover for themselves. While Jesus had the leaders really angry, he was incredibly popular with the man on the street. And these leaders were smart enough to know that if they were seen as the primary culprits in putting Jesus to death, they would be taking a serious hit in the opinion polls of the general public. If they could find a way to turn Jesus over to the Romans, who were already disliked by the Jews, and have the Romans be the one who condemned him and put him to death, that would take the pressure off of them. This relationship between Rome and the leadership of the Jews was a tense one. I talked about this last week a little bit. The Jewish leaders needed Pilate, but they detested him. In fact, within 40 years, the Jewish leadership would instigate a rebellion against Rome there in Jerusalem, a great uprising, their bid for freedom. And they were terribly defeated, decimated. The Sadducees, who were the elite ruling class among the Jews at this time, when that rebellion was put down, they disappeared into obscurity, stripped of all their power, hunted down, and you never hear from the Sadducees again. The temple, that was the symbol of their religious life, their status, their power, when that rebellion was put down, that temple would be razed to the ground and destroyed. Ironically, the name of Jesus, the cause of Jesus, would only continue to grow and grow in its influence in Rome until one day it would be the official religion of Rome. But at this point, Pilate needed the Jewish leaders. He had to placate them in order to keep his province under control. And though he needed them to maintain control, he also found these ways to show his disrespect for the Jews and for the Samaritans, which ultimately became the grounds for his own demise. But right now, Jesus is the pawn caught in the middle, or at least so they think. Both sides trying to use him to undermine one another for their own ends. What did Pilate think of Jesus? Well, as you read the narrative, one of the things that stands out to me is that Pilate is intrigued by Jesus. I think that Pilate was a man who was accustomed to convicted people, arrested people being brought before him, and he could see they were nervous, they were afraid. The eyes are downcast, the answers are stuttered and maybe whispered. People are quick to spill out just a ream of excuses for whatever it was they're being accused of because they're hoping to escape their fate. And yet Jesus isn't like that. Jesus looks Pilate full in the face, makes solid eye contact. He speaks calmly, directly. He seems to be at ease, not afraid. He's even willing to interrogate the interrogator. He says, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" His answers are direct, but they're also cagey. I mentioned this last week, that Pilate wanted to hear Jesus say the words, "I am the King of the Jews," because then he would have all the justification to condemn him to death. And so he says, "Are you a king?" And Jesus responds to him, "You say that I'm a king." Well, that wasn't quite the answer he was looking for. And I think Pilate recognized that Jesus was smart. He understood the game, and he was pretty good at it. And so I think Pilate was intrigued by this man. He also is a little bit intimidated. In fact, we find this interchange. The Jews, speaking to Pilate, said, "We have a law that according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. So he's already a little worried. Now he's even more worried. And he entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Now, I don't think that title, Son of God, had the same implications in Pilate's mind that it did for the Jews. The Jews, being monotheistic, this idea that Jesus was equating himself to God, that was blasphemy to them. The Romans were not monotheistic. They were polytheistic. They had all kinds of deities they worshiped. And they also believed in divine men, that there were men who had a special connection with the gods. And so what Pilate heard was, possibly this guy that you're talking to who has already unsettled you with the way he carries himself, he may be a divine man. Well, do you want to mess with a divine man? Herod had some of these same fears after he'd put John the Baptist to death. He became aware of the things that Jesus' disciples were doing and that Jesus was doing. And Herod's first thought was, maybe this is John, whom I beheaded, who's been raised from the dead. That superstitious streak was there to think there is more going on than meets the eye here. I think that's true for all of us. There is that spiritual component in us that says there is more going on. There is more to this life. I just saw a new research paper that was done by 4 British universities, funded by the Templeton Foundation. The report was called Understanding Unbelief, Atheists and Agnostics Around the World. And it was a study of atheists and agnostics in Brazil, China, Denmark, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. They had 8 key findings, but one of those was that unbelief in God doesn't necessarily entail unbelief in other supernatural phenomena. In fact, they found that it was really just a minority of atheists and agnostics that were thoroughgoing naturalists, that didn't think there was anything spiritually above and beyond ourselves. We know in the core of our being that there is more to life than just the material world. I remember as a chaplain attending the death of a gentleman, and when I showed up, the deputies told me that I was going to talk to the wife, and they said, "Well, just so you know, this guy's an atheist." And I said, "That's fine. We're chaplains. We'll take care of atheists too, But as I got to know his wife, we were talking, she finally confided to me, and she said, he wasn't really a very good atheist. Matthew gives us a little additional insight into what was going on for Pilate, why he was unsettled. It said, while Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." So for a man who has some spiritual underpinnings, some superstition, some uncertainty about who Jesus is, suddenly he gets a messenger coming from his wife, and she says, "I've had a vision, and you should stay away from this guy." Pilate is worried enough that he is not inclined to authorize the execution of this man. And that's the third thing we learn about Pilate, is that he is quite insistent on the innocence of Jesus. He is not willing to condemn him. John records at least 6 times in his account that Pilate either declares that Jesus is innocent or that he makes attempts to have him released. We find that Pilate tries to negotiate by offering a way for them to have Jesus released as part of the Passover celebration. We find him trying to placate them by humiliating Jesus, letting his soldiers have sport with him in hopes that once they see that Jesus has been humiliated, that he's been punished, that they'll relent from this idea of having him put to death. We're told that he had Jesus flogged. Roman flogging could take one of 3 forms. The lightest, and I'm going to butcher the Italian here, but it's fustigatio, and it was handed out for more minor crimes. The second one, flagellatio, was a brutal flogging for criminals with serious offenses. And the final, verberatio, was the most terrible of all. It was always associated with other punishments, including crucifixion. And that is the flogging that people would often die just from the flogging. It was so brutal. Most likely at this point, the beating that was given to Jesus was not that most extreme form. From the other gospel accounts, it appears that Jesus was beaten twice. That the second beating was the really severe beating in preparation for going to the cross. And one of the reasons for that was it would hasten death. That because the Jews wanted to be sure that this was done before the Passover, they probably beat Jesus again to hasten death. But at this point, it's probably one of those lesser 2 floggings that are given because Pilate doesn't want to kill Jesus. He's trying to appease the Jews. He needs the Jews to support him, but he doesn't want to kill Jesus. And then we have the story of the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Having beaten him, the soldiers turn to mockery. They dress him in this purple robe and put this crown of thorns on. And then Pilate joins in as he brings Jesus out to present him to the Jews. Pilate says to them, "Behold the man." Or maybe to paraphrase that, what I think he is saying to these leaders is, you brought this man to me with the charges that he was a great danger, that he proclaimed himself to be king of the Jews, and that I should execute him for his sedition and his rebellion. Well, here he is, and I want you to see that he is both pitiful and powerless. There is nothing to worry about with this man, and I find him innocent. And yet the Jews were not satisfied. They didn't want just humiliation, they wanted execution. But John says that Pilate still kept trying to find a way. It says from then on, Pilate sought to release him. But Pilate finally caves, but even in that, he displays his contempt for what's going on. It says, when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." This comes from Matthew's account. Interesting observation. I'll just point this out to you. Back in John chapter 19, if you compare verses 5 through 7 with verses 14 through 15, there are these 2 very parallel conversations that happen. Pilate says to the Jews, "Behold the man." The second time, Pilate said to the Jews, "Behold your king." The Jews respond, "Crucify him, crucify him." The second time, away with him, crucify him." Pilate says, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The second time, "Shall I crucify your king?" And finally, the Jews answered, "We have a law. According to that law, he ought to die because he's made himself the Son of God." The second time, "We have no king but Caesar." You can see where first, Pilate keeps trying to establish that this man is no threat to you. And they keep coming back and saying, "No, we want him crucified." And Pilate, reluctant, first says, "Well, you do it yourselves," knowing that they didn't have any legal right to do that. And the second time, he's saying, "Shall I crucify your king? Do you really want me to do this?" And then the Jews answered the first time, "We have a law. Based on our law, we reject him." And the second time, it becomes political. "We have no king but Caesar. We have a law, we have a king. We do not want this king." Well, his final revenge on the Jews was the placard that went with Jesus to the cross. Pilate wrote an inscription and put it on the cross, and it read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, 'I'm King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." I think Pilate was seeking to do two things in this message. One, he is ridiculing the Jewish leaders and really the Jewish people by putting a public proclamation that this man hanging in disgrace on a cross is the nearest thing the Jews have to a king. Here's your king. But the second thing he wanted to do was take that title that he knew these leaders so wanted to abolish and flaunt it and taunt it in their face until the very end. But it's funny because sometimes we speak better than we know. While Pilate was trying to denigrate Jesus and denigrate the Jews, the fact was he was the one who properly declared who Jesus was, that he really was the king. And in writing that declaration in every trade language, he was really proclaiming that Jesus was the King of all. He was the Savior of the world. Why did Pilate capitulate? Why did he give in? Well, it all hinges on this little phrase, the friend of Caesar. Pilate sought to release him. The Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. The power that he craved, one thing that Pilate valued above justice was power. He enjoyed having it. He enjoyed showing it off. Remember, he was quick to remind Jesus about his power. When Jesus didn't answer him, he says, "Do you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you? Do you understand who I am? The kind of power, I have the power of life and death, Jesus. Why will you not answer me?" The Jews come back and say, "Well, if you don't execute him, you're no friend of Caesar." The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives away over $4 billion a year. That is $11 million per day, 365 days a year. That's a lot of money. And because of that, they get lots of requests for help. They actually have a staff of 1,500 people just to process giving that money away. And they get requests by the hundreds and by the thousands from countries, from charitable organizations, and also from individuals who are looking for assistance. And there's one kind of request they get a lot of. It even has its own designation. They call them FOBs, Friends of Bill. And what that means is the guy that says, "Hey, I was a friend of Bill's back in high school, and I need a little help. I was a friend of Bill's at his first job. I was a friend of Bill's." Being an FOB, they hope, means that they will qualify for some of those millions of dollars that are being given away. Now, back in the days of Pilate, FOB didn't mean a whole lot, but FOC, that did, to be a friend of Caesar. In fact, friend of Caesar was actually a technical title. It was a designation, and if you were designated as an FOC, a friend of Caesar, all kinds of political benefits went along with that. We don't know if from this reference, Pilate had actually gotten that designation, or it was merely something that he was aspiring to. But when they threw that one out, and they threw in the fear that the Jews were making, this not so thinly veiled threat that if you don't do what we want, there's a really good chance that a bad report about you might get back to Caesar. Something to the effect of, you don't mind if there are people in your domain that are trying to overthrow the Roman emperor, who's a really paranoid, crazy individual. You might want to just think about that before you deny our request. Ramsey Michael says that in order to execute Jesus, the Jewish authorities make themselves out to be more loyal subjects of Caesar than the hated Roman official Pilate is. That threat might have had some extra clout because I told you early on that Pilate got his position thanks to this high-ranking official named Sejanus. Sejanus himself loved power and pursued power, and that eventually got him in trouble. while he was at one point one of Tiberius's most trusted advisors, he eventually fell from power and, in fact, was executed around 31 AD. That, of course, then put all of Sejanus's political friends in jeopardy themselves. So we don't know if the fall of Sejanus had happened just prior to this or if it happened afterwards. If it happened just prior, it adds even more clout to why this threat about a bad report getting back to you would make Pilate so nervous, because he was already in a very tenuous situation. Well, it got Pilate's attention, and as soon as he knew the Jews were willing to play that card, his course of action turned 180 degrees. What you see dominating the last hours of Jesus' life is really just a naked struggle for power. Who will wear the crown? The Jewish leaders might not have had access to a literal crown, but they wanted the kind of power that crowns represent. Pilate certainly had the favor of the crown. He made sure the Jews knew it. It was ultimately the threat of a more powerful crown giver that drove Pilate to be willing to let Christ be put to death. Of course, the drama played itself out in this macabre pantomime where a crown of thorns is thrust onto Jesus' head to mock him as a poor and a powerless king. The irony is, Jesus was the only real king present. As he reminded Pilate, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." In the Old Testament, there was the concept of the scapegoat. The scapegoat was part of the sacrificial system that the priest would lay his hands on the head of this animal and symbolically transfer the sins of the people onto this goat, who was then taken outside of the camp and slain. That animal was a foreshadow of what Jesus was going to do. The writer of Hebrews says that Jesus also suffered outside the city gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. I would pose to you that the crown of thorns was a very good symbol of what was placed on Jesus' head. The lust for power, the lust to be in control, and that Jesus took that sin and carried it with him out of the city. I think this is a conflict that we still face. We have to answer this question constantly in our own lives. Who will wear the crown? We know Jesus is unique. We say he's king. We proclaim that. We come to church on a Sunday morning and we sing songs all about it. And we listen to sermons about it. And we say, yeah, that's right, Jesus is king. But sometimes, maybe as early as on the drive home or come Monday morning, we take the crown back off of Jesus and take it back for ourselves. You know, Jesus came to set us free from that false kingdom of self. I guess the question that I've been thinking about this week is, where am I unwilling to give up the crown? What area of my life is it that I say, well, Jesus, you get to be king, but not over that? Is it my entertainment? Is it my tax returns? My love life, my career goals, my retirement plans, my credit card, my giving, my time management, my friendships, my grudges? What is it that I say, this is mine? I'll tell you where I get tempted to grab the crown. Maybe this gets you too. When I get mad. When I get angry about something, I want to be in control. I want to be in charge. I would like to pass sentence, and I know that my judgment is right, that the penalty that I want to inflict on the person who has angered me is the right thing that should happen. I love what James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20 says. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. My little kingdom, when I'm mad, rarely achieves God's righteousness. Am I willing to be quick to listen, to just slow down, to both listen to others and listen to the Lord? Am I willing to stop talking, to close my mouth and be slow to speak, and to recognize that my anger rarely accomplishes God's righteousness to let him be the king. See, Jesus didn't come to wrestle with us over the crown. He came to declare the truth that he is the king and all other claims to the throne are false. His way is not just a way to live, it is the only way that is truly living. John 1 reminds us that Jesus was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Here's a question that I would leave you with. What does it mean to receive a king? If the king was coming to your house, what would it mean to receive him? It means that you give him the keys to the kingdom, all of the rooms. I don't know about you, but I know in my life there are times that there are certain rooms I go, Lord, you can have all the other keys, but not this one. This key right here is mine. That room is off limits. I will remain in control of that one. But if I really have received the king, then I need to unlock all the doors in my heart. Is there a crown that you're unwilling to release? Jesus came to relieve you of that burden. He is the only king that can truly wear the crown. Maybe before you leave this morning, it would be a good thing to spend some time in prayer and let the king truly be the king. Amen.